Hello and welcome to our next episode of a virtual tour of the Holy Land. I'm Dr. Brennan Roach, and I'm excited to be with you tonight as we have a look at the biblical city of Jericho. And we've called this episode God in the Midst because we want to see how God's moving in the midst of his people and how this is a significant change that starts to happen in the biblical city of Jericho. So let's have a look at our PowerPoint here, and on the first one that we can see Jericho in the midst, and we have the ancient ruins of the city of Jericho that you can see as part of the picture that we have there. So God in our midst, our journey into the promised land reveals a new place or a new position that we as believers have in God. In Egypt, God was distant, quiet, and our escape from sin in the wilderness. God was a provider of food and water and shelter that and provisions that kept them alive in the wilderness. And on the journey from the wilderness, God was leading them into the promised land. Then, remember last week we talked about the crossing of the Jordan River, where God was our cleansing. So now we find them crossed over the Jordan River into the promised land. And we are going to see and we are going to discover how God is in their midst. So let's just have a little quick review on what we've done in the last few episodes. We started with Mount Nebo, which was the place of promise, and we can see the promised land, but we might not necessarily be able to enter the promised land. And that's the whole idea of what was happening with Moses. He was up on Mount Nebo. He could see the promised land, but he couldn't enter into it. Then we talked about Sodom. Now, Sodom was just down from Mount Nebo. They came down and they were about to cross into the Jordan River, and they went past Sodom. And we found out that Sodom was actually the place of righteousness, and that God was looking for righteous people in the place of Sodom. And we found out a lot about the calling of God and generational callings and things like that. So if you want to learn more about that, go back and have a look at the episode on Sodom. And then we did a really interesting study of the Jordan River. Most people don't think about the Jordan River as a biblical place, but we talked about how important the Jordan River was right from its source in Mount Hermon and Tel Dan, all the way through to the crossing location, the cleansing, the baptismal spot of John the Baptist, flowing into the metaphor, that being the Dead Sea or the Sea of Sin. So we remember the Jordan River as the place of cleansing. So now we are about to enter into the place of promise. So as we're entering into the place of promise, we need to be in the right standing with God. So they're there to enter into the promised land. They need to be washed. They need to be cleaned. They need to be in right place with God in order to enter into the promised land. So they must have cleansed. Now, remember, we also talked about when they crossed over into the Jordan River, that this was also they needed faith. So it was important that they had faith because the priest stepped out. We talked about how Moses, he lifted up the staff and the people entered into the Red Sea after the waters had parted. Now we've got Joshua crossing into the promised land, and the priests step out into the water, and they must be there and they must step out in faith first. Then the water stops, and then all the people of God cross over. So now we need how to learn in this promise, or how to live in this promise. Romans puts it this way. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 says, "And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind that he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. do not copy the behavior and customs of this world. So they're entering the promised land. They've just gone past the reminder of sin in Sodom, and now they're entering into the promised land, but the promised land is full of idols. And we're going to have a different gods and godly customs and things like that. So we're going to have a little bit of a look at that tonight as we go on. But let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Okay, so where are we? We've got the map up, and we can have a look at the map there, and we can see we've got Mount Nebo, and then we've traveled down to Sodom, and we're seeing they're crossing the Jordan River and moving across to Jericho. Now, one of the things that you'll notice that Jericho and Sodom are almost mirror cities, or in some countries you might call them twin cities, where you've got similar cities that are one side of the river to the other. And this is exactly, so we talked about Sodom, and Sodom had been destroyed for hundreds of years, and Jericho was actually across the river at the time that Sodom was. Some people say Jericho might even go back to 8,000 BC, one of the earliest walled cities in the region. And there's some interesting archaeological evidence for that. So we're there at the ancient city, and it's very similar. So we've actually got Sodom and Jericho that not only were similar cities, and we talked about how important they had water, they had agriculture, they had land, they had defensive structures, and again, they're in that really important transitional place or transportation place that allowed people to go north, south, and east, west. You can just see there, if you just go a little bit east, it's on the direct path on the way to Jerusalem. And when we get there, we're not going to Jerusalem just yet, but we're going to go to the place, we're going to go through the valley of the shadow of death. And that will be our next journey. Where does the valley of the shadow of death start? You walk from Jericho up to Jerusalem. So we're going to have a little bit of a look at that in one of our future episodes, and that'll be interesting. So Jericho is only 50 kilometers to Jerusalem, but it's actually still about 400, 380 meters below sea level. Jerusalem is well over 1,000, 1,200 meters above sea level. So you've got a long climb up as you make your way up to Jerusalem. So that's why the scriptures and the Psalms and always talk about going up to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem's on the top of the mountain and we see Jericho down here. So when are we? When is this all happening? So this is 1406 BC, and the Hebrews or the Jews are now camped inside the promised land. So they're in the plains of the Jordan River, and they're planning to attack Jericho. So that's what's actually going on in this location. And we can see we've been journeying out of Egypt into the wilderness, and then 40 years in the wilderness, and now we're coming to enter into the promised land. So what's actually happened here? Now, we've got to think about the background. What's the story telling us? What's it leading up to at this particular point in time? So the Egyptian gods have been defeated. Okay, so that's what the plagues are about. That's what the battles were about. That's what the Egyptian army being destroyed in the Red Sea was all about, was actually the Egyptian gods being defeated. So now is the time for the Canaanite gods to be defeated, or for God to go into battle with the Canaanite gods. In Joshua chapter 5, verse 9, we see it says, "Then the Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the shame of your slavery in Egypt." So again, direct reference to what's actually occurred. So that place has been called Gilgal to this day. So that was the place. So as such, in the place of Gilgal is very much a spiritual battle, which is occurring here. We think about what's actually occurring, and we understand the story and the walking around the city walls and the city walls crumbling, and that's actually God's created this amazing miracle of what we actually have there of the city actually being destroyed. But what's actually occurring here, and the things that we need to understand, that this is actually a spiritual battle that's being undertaken. To take the promised land, first They needed to defeat the most powerful gods of the lands. So we see here, here's a little bit of a slide, and to give you a little bit of an idea of what the ancient city, of course, this is just a graphic of what the city would have looked like. Some of the interesting things that you'll see if we have a look in the middle, that's what we call the upper city, and many ancient cities have an upper and a lower city. The upper city was always where the temples were and where the more wealthy and the priests and those people stayed. And then you've got a lower city with the second wall here. So when we think about and we talk about Rahab, have a look at that second wall. So Rahab lived in that second wall. And we will talk a little bit about Rahab later, and we might get to talk about the wall and why would she live in a wall and what does that actually mean. So we can see that there. So we've got so we come back to Jericho. Now, Jericho was strategic in that it controlled the whole region. It was the biggest city and the most powerful city in the whole of Canaan at that particular point in time. So we're actually coming into that, and in taking that city, what's happening here is we're not progressively taking, like is quite often military strategy. You take smaller cities and you defeat them. And then when all the smaller cities are defeated, you then attack the larger city so that you don't have to worry about other people coming and attacking you while you're trying to attack that large city. So to take the promised land, first they needed to defeat the most powerful gods of the land. Early in the Canaanite religion, there was a male moon god known as Jericho. Now he was the chief god of all the Canaanite gods of the what we call the pantheon or the hierarchy of gods. And there was a female sun god, Shamash, who was his cohort, and later they became known as very common biblical gods known as Baal and Asheroth. Now these were the Canaanite gods. You think about Baal being the god where Elijah is calling down fire. That's the Baal god, or Baal god, some people call it. Now, the story of the Old Testament is littered with priests and prophets and kings battling or not supporting, depending on the way the story goes, the Baal gods and the Ashereth gods. Just think about Elijah calling down fire and the prophets of Baal, and Jezebel is very much one of the supporters of these Canaanite local gods. So for God to prove himself in the same way that Egypt was completely defeated by the people of God, for God to prove his absolute power, i.e., that he is the one true God, we see that he comes in and the battle that is actually occurring here is a battle between the one true God and the local gods. Now, we're not going through the minor gods, small gods. What's actually happening here is in Jericho, this was the city of the Canaanite gods, of the most powerful gods. So Jericho was the most powerful city in the region. Jericho was the seat of spiritual power, military power, and it was the city of the most powerful king in the whole land. So let's just move on to the next slide. So Jericho is what we call the city of the gods, the home of the Canaanite gods. And we see that Jericho was the most powerful city. It was a seat of spiritual power. And it was also the city of Jericho was also the city where we see the legend of King Keret. Now, King Keret is a legend or a fable, but that's what we'd call it. But the people saw that as a real story of the gods and why the gods had chosen the city of Jericho. Now, the king of Jericho was also seen as the divine king of the region, and we got or representative, and we've got Joshua, who is the representative of God. So again, we've got the battle of the gods. We've got the leaders. So think about the same type of thing happening in Egypt. We've got Pharaoh and we've got Moses. So now we've got the king of the city of Jericho and we've got Joshua who are representing. So we also see the time of the battle was also the height of the power of those gods. Now the gods in the ancient world would be revolving around the as these were lunar and solar gods, so they would be around the agricultural cycle. So there would be different points, generally around the harvest or the planting or other times, when these gods would be seen to be the most powerful because they produced the food, the crops, the fertility of the land, the fertility of the animals. So that was incredibly important. So we actually see the events of this occurring at the time when these gods were the most powerful they were in their particular god. So what's actually happening is Joshua and God aren't going after minor cities, they aren't going after minor gods. They're going after the Canaanites' two most powerful gods, the mother and the father of the gods, and they're going after them at the time, which is the heightened time when those gods are being worshipped and they are at their most powerful. So what I like to call the battle of the gods, we've got the one true God must defeat the false gods of Jericho. And this is the city of the most powerful gods. They're at the most powerful time, and they are in the most powerful and fortified city, and also where potentially all the other kings of the region could potentially come to their defense. So strategically, this isn't a good idea. Militarily, this is not a good idea. But what we're actually seeing is the God of the people of Israel is so powerful that they are going forward with that. So that's what's actually occurring in this particular point in time. Now, I'm just going to give you a really, really quick summary of the fable or the story of King Correct. Now, why this is so important to us is actually what's happening here is when the people of Israel come in, and what's occurring is they are retelling the legend. They are redoing the legend, but they're doing it not with the power of their gods, as in the Canaanite gods, but they're doing it with the power of the one true God. So here's some similarities in the story. And when you start to see this, it starts to empower you. You think about Moses another example of Moses in the reeds. And that was a story of a great leader would be found in the reeds and will be saved from the reeds. So Moses becomes this powerful character because he is seen to be fulfilling a legend or a prophecy. So as well, Joshua is seen to be fulfilling a legend or a prophecy. And we see many of the different elements of the story remain the same. We talk about the mighty men and the men of war going out first and all the people. There's trumpets in both. There's no noise. So have you ever wondered why they never, apart from the trumpets, why the people weren't asked to say or do anything? This is because it's happening in the same way as this prophecy and fable being fulfilled. They march for 6 days. On the seventh day, they march around 7 times. On the seventh day, they shout out. There's gold and silver that's captured that is used for the purpose of holiness. Sacred items are created out of that. And interesting, there's a story about this woman in both. Now, we know her as Rahab, and the woman in both stories is saved. The woman becomes the mother of the king, and Rahab is in the lineage of King David, and she has saved 2 messengers. So this sort of speaks into the understanding as to why the people of Jericho were so terrified as to what was going on, because they understood exactly what's going on. We think it's maybe something to be mimicked, and we walk around the church, we walk around our neighborhood, and we pray, and that's all great. But what's actually going on is we've got the people in the city are sitting there watching, and they understand exactly what's happening. And they realize that this is a spiritual battle. They realize that this is what's going on. Joshua chapter 2, verses 8 and 9 says, before the spies went to sleep that night, Rahab went up on the roof to talk to them. I know the Lord has given you this land. Why did she know? Why? Why did she think that? She thought that because she could see the prophecy being fulfilled and outtold, the things that the priests had told them would happen. They went, oh my God, this is the Canaanite gods. This is what's happening to us here and there. I know the Lord has given you this land, she told them. We are all afraid of you. Everyone is in the land is living in terror. So we see the amazing how God uses local customs and local stories to see what's happening. So we had three critical incidents that build up to part of this story. We see the first of them is the appearance of the commander of the army of the Lord. Now, that's actually an image of Jesus, Jesus appearing before he, and it's what we call a Christophany. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then we've got the crossing of the Jordan River and the memorial stones. We've already spoken in detail about those things in the last episode about crossing the Jordan River. Then we've got the defeat of the city of Jericho and the saving of Rahab. Now, each of these incidents has an incredible amount to it, which is really, really important. So let's have a look at some of those in a little bit of detail. We see the commander of the army of the Lord. This is what we call a theophany or a Christophany or where Jesus, in this case, actually comes. So how do we know it's Jesus? Because this, what appears to potentially be an angel, actually receives worship, and the only one who can receive worship, of course, is Jesus. So Jesus appeared to Joshua, and we know that it's Jesus because he receives worship. So what this tells us is that Joshua is going into battle with the commander of the army of the Lord at its head. So what does that mean? It means it's first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and 10th, a spiritual battle. That's what it is. That's what's actually occurring. It's a spiritual battle. Why? Because Jesus, the Son of God, is at the head of the battle. And therefore, it's a spiritual battle with great spiritual importance and spiritual significance. The second thing we see is the crossing of the Jordan River. And the crossing of the Jordan River, we see that, and we've talked a bit about that, and the power of and the correlation of how we compare the crossing of the Jordan River with the Red Sea. So when Moses crossed the Red Sea, he lifted his hands, God opened up the waters, and they walked through. But what we see here is they must step out in faith. So the first step is escaping from sin. The second is when God leads us and when we must take a step of faith. So as they enter into the promised land, what's critically important about this is to enter into the promised land, you must take a step of faith. To be in the promised land, once you're in the promised land, you need to have God in your midst. So we see when they're walking around the city, when they're just marching, and when they eventually attack, they have the soldiers in the front, the priests with the Ark of the Covenant, and then they have the soldiers behind. And what does that mean? That you must carry the presence of God with you. You must not just have all the soldiers at the front, you not have the Ark of the Covenant at the front, you not have it behind, you don't leave it on the other side. You have to carry the presence of God with you when you are entering into the promises that God has for you. So that's really, really important thing that we need to understand what's going on there. And then, of course, we've got the memorial stones. And we know, again, from our last episode, that the memorial stones are very important because every time that they're erected to remember a particular event. So these standing stones were placed all around Israel to commemorate a significant event or milestone. The idea behind them is it'll be a reminder for generations. So remember, we're going up to Jerusalem from this point. We're going to talk about that in future episodes. So every time you're on your way to pilgrimage from Jerusalem, from what would be modern day Iraq or Iran, or you're coming through the north, you're coming through Europe, and you're coming by land, you're coming down and you're coming through, and you're coming through Jericho, or you're coming up from Egypt and you're coming by land, you're coming through Jericho. So it doesn't matter whether you're coming from the north, the south, the east, or the west. When you're coming up to Jerusalem on pilgrimage, unless you've come by boat and you've landed in the Mediterranean Sea, then you'll come from the other side. But you're coming up through Jericho. So every time, and that's what 99.9% of people did, they came up through Jericho and they would see the memorial standing stones that would remember them entering into the promised land, and remember, and a remembrance that they defeated the city of Jericho, and would tell about how they would go on into the promised land. So the ancient city of Jericho is known for its amazing story, and how the army of Israel marched around it 7 times and the walls collapsed and it eventually came down. So what we're actually going to do now is I just want to have a quick look at the archaeology of Jericho. Now, that's one of the things I love. It's one of the things I've studied. So in each one of these lessons, we're going to have a look at a little bit of what the archaeology of each one of these sites says. So in the 1950s, a British archaeologist by the name of Kathleen Kenyon excavated Jericho and found clear evidence for collapsed walls. Okay, so she excavated and found now the walls were the original city was made out of mud bricks. And she found that since then, many archaeologists have studied and excavated the site. And all archaeologists agree, whether they're Christian, Jewish, have no faith whatsoever, that there was a city wall. And they all agree that at some stage the city wall collapsed and was broken down. The only disagreement comes around the date. And I think essentially that's people who want to find a reason to not believe the Bible actually start to talk about what this is. So here we have in recent times. So here's a slide of the archaeological site. Like many of the archaeological sites, there's not a lot there. Although I have, when I was doing some research for this, noticed that there has been some reconstruction work done in the last couple of years. And so I look forward to going back to Jericho and having a look at some of that reconstruction work, because it's always very helpful to see the reconstructions. It gives us a bit of an idea of how the city would have actually looked. So one of the key things about dating and understanding what's actually happening in the city of Jericho with the archaeology is what we call pottery. Now, pottery and all these different examples of pottery. Pottery is very, very helpful for giving us dates, because pottery is something that goes, for want of a better word, in and out of fashion. Pottery is quite often made a particular way in a particular region. So we've got some examples here of the pottery of Jericho, and Dr. Woods, who went there in 1999, he did his PhD and studied the pottery. He argues that the date of the destruction of this pottery and the destruction of the wall, because it's found within the collapsed remains of the wall, so we know it happened exactly at the same time, we see that there was a distinctive pottery which we can see it's got beautiful patterns and markings and things like that, and that fits in perfectly with the time of the Israelite conquest according to the biblical chronology. So we have, again, very clear evidence here for the destruction. Now, what we actually, and this is an original image or diagram from Kathleen Kenyon's work. And you can imagine this is sort of without the city walls being built here, but that red section there of the red bricks that you can see, that's where the bricks have actually collapsed. So the wall has actually collapsed and slid down, and there's a pile of bricks at the bottom of the wall. Now, this is uncontested. Everybody agrees that this is exactly what happened, that the wall collapsed, these mud brick walls collapsed, and they found them at the bottom of the hill where it was. So this is incredible. We have another slide here of an archaeologist, and he's in the pit, and he's actually pointing to some of these mud bricks. And if you're really, really clever, you can see a slightly darker tinge. Why is it darker? Because that's where the ash layer of the city being burnt. So the wall collapses, the army comes in, attacks, and burns the whole city to the ground. So, of course, the collapsed walls at the bottom, and then all the debris with the ash and the discoloration of that dark ash color we find above that. So, again, exact evidence of what the biblical account says occurred. Okay, so what can we learn? What can we learn from what happened in the city of Israel? And I forgot to actually tell you, I'm looking forward to seeing. Feel free to ask questions, and we've got a few people there that have joined us from different places. Hey, if you can just tell me in the comments what city you're from, what country you're from, that would be great, because I know we've got different people from all around the place. I can see that we've got some people there who are commenting, and we'd love to put that up. And that's fantastic that you're enjoying what we're actually doing there. So let's get back to the lesson, and we see some lessons learned from Jericho, and we can see what was actually occurring at that particular point. So, hey, so just let me finish off with what Dr. Wood says. He concludes that Jericho was once thought as a Bible problem because of the seeming disagreement between archaeology and the Bible. When the archaeology is correctly interpreted, however, the opposite is the case. The archaeological evidence supports the historical accuracy of the biblical account in every detail. Every aspect of the story that could be verified by the findings of archaeology has been verified. So, what are the lessons that we can learn? What are the things that we can think about and put into our life? So, first of all, what we understand is that the Bible was not written as a book of history, but rather it was written as a book about God. So, in Jericho, the gods of this world are defeated with spiritual power, not physical force. Okay, so that the walls collapse, the people are in terror, the people are in fear, and then the army goes in and basically finishes off the work. But it's not the army that got them into the city. It's not the army who got the victory. It's actually God, the one true God, and being able to defeat the Canaanite gods, the most powerful gods in the most powerful cities. So once the gods of this world are defeated, the walls will come tumbling down. So let me just go through that again. Once the gods of this world are defeated, the walls come tumbling down, and then the people of God can enter in and take what is rightfully theirs, what is in their promised land. The enemy will stop. The enemy will try and dissuade. The enemy will say it can't be done. The enemy will get you to look at the walls and try and convince you that there is no way known those walls are coming down. But those walls are spiritual walls, and God is the God more powerful than all the demons in this world and all the demonic gods of this world, and will bring them down. So the second thing we see is archaeology provides some answers to questions, but it gives us more questions. So that's a bit of we'll talk more about that as it goes along, that archaeology will quite often give us so much more information than what the Bible does. So what do we do with that? Well, what I like to do with that is we must allow our understanding of the Bible to grow with our study and our understanding of history and culture that we find in the study of archaeology and history. But you see, archaeology is not the basis of my faith. History is not the basis of my faith. Culture is not the basis of my faith. You see, my faith comes from experiencing God personally. My faith comes from an unwavering belief in the Word of God. So when faith and archaeology are in conflict, when faith and culture are in conflict, when faith and science are in conflict, when faith and history are in conflict, my faith in God is not in conflict, but rather it's just my limited understanding of both and how they actually work together and how we understand those things and how they actually work together. A conflict is where I stand. In any conflict, I stand content, knowing that I will never know and understand all there is to knowing God. So it's really important that we don't get worried as if we have to have the answer to everything. We have to have the answer to what all people are saying. We don't need to have those answers. So it's been great being with you, and thank you very much for being with us tonight. So next week we will actually see. We've got Josiah from Melbourne. Good on you, Josiah. Good on you. And just surprise, Josiah's my son, so I'm glad he's watching from Melbourne. Good on you, mate. Very good to have you here, and good to see lots of other people watching. So next week, what we're going to do is that the psalm that talks about going through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. So that's really interesting, and I've done a lot of study on that. And the path goes from Jericho up to the Inn of the Good Samaritan. So that'll be what we talk about the week after before we get to Jerusalem. There's so many amazing things. But when we actually see the images and the photos, and we're going to go through the psalm, and then it just comes alive. It's just amazing what the psalm is actually teaching when you actually see and understand it in the physical culture of the land. Okay, so that's what we're going to do next week. This has been about Jericho. This is about defeating the spiritual gods and getting victory in God, and understanding that when we're fighting a battle, it's all about getting victory in Christ and winning the spiritual battle first before we try and win the physical battle. God bless you. Keep going, and we'll see you next time with another study from myself, Dr. Brennan Roach, the founder of Acts Bible College. Good on you. God bless you. Bye for now.